When you first start animating, it's exciting just to make something move. But then at some point you start noticing other motion designers' work, and their animations feel smoother, more intentional, like there's actual weight and personality behind the motion. And if you compare that to your own work, even if you're doing everything right, something still feels a bit off. It's not terrible, but it's stiff, or flat, or kind of lifeless. The number one mistake that I see beginner motion designers make, and that I've made myself, is avoiding the graph editor. And the problem isn't just not using the graph editor, it's not understanding what it's actually showing you. Because if you're relying on linear keyframes or just slapping easy ease on everything and calling it a day, that's why your animation doesn't feel professional. The graph editor is one of the biggest things standing between my animation works and this animation actually feels good to watch. Take a look at this animation. Pretty stiff. Now here's the same animation with easy ease applied. Better, but still pretty basic. Now here's what it looks like after I've adjusted the motion curves in the graph editor. This is the type of work that'll get you hired. By the way, this animation comes from my new beginner After Effects course. I'll tell you more about it at the end, so stick around. As you watch this video, you can follow along by downloading the exact project file that I'm using here. Plus, you'll get a cheat sheet that summarizes everything we're about to cover and some simple exercises so you can actually practice using the graph editor instead of just watching me do it. The link is in the description. When you set keyframes in After Effects, by default they're linear. Linear keyframes are diamond-shaped. These little dots on the motion path of a layer show you how much the layer moves for each frame. If you don't see the motion path and your layer is selected and has keyframes on the position property, click this button so that it's toggled on. Notice that for these linear keyframes, the space between each dot is the same. When the dots are evenly spaced, the layer is moving at a constant speed. That's why linear keyframes feel abrupt and mechanical. Most of the time, you don't want to leave your keyframes like this. So on this second layer, I have the exact same keyframes, same timing, but on these ones, I'm going to apply easy ease. To do that, right-click on any of the selected keyframes, go to Keyframe Assistant, then choose Easy Ease, or the keyboard shortcut is F9. Notice how this changed the keyframes to hourglass shapes. For the Easy Ease layer, there's less space between frames at the beginning and end of the animation, and in the middle, there's more space. So this means the shape starts off by moving slowly, speeds up, then slows down before coming to a stop. Easy Ease usually looks better than linear keyframes because it's closer to how motion works in the real world. Think about a car starting to drive or an animal starting to run. They don't instantly jump to full speed or stop on a dime. Instead, they accelerate as they're starting to move and then decelerate as they're coming to a stop. But Easy Ease is just the starting point. If you stop here and accept the default curve, all of your animations feel the same and kind of boring. This is where the graph editor comes in. The graph editor allows you to control the spacing of your animation, what happens in the time between keyframes. To get to the graph editor, first select at least one keyframe of whatever property you want to see. Then click this graph icon. There are two kinds of graphs you can see in the graph editor, the value graph and the speed graph. If you have auto select graph type checked here, After Effects will guess which type of graph you'll find most helpful for that property, but you can always change the graph type here. First, let's look at the value graph. This line shows the value of the property, so in this case, rotation over time. So time is on the x-axis and rotation is on the y-axis. These squares are the keyframes. These are linear keyframes, so the graph is a straight diagonal line which shows the rotation is changing the same amount each frame. It's moving at a steady speed, never slowing down or speeding up. If I switch over to the speed graph, it tells us exactly that. The speed is constant the whole time. The speed graph maps out speed on the y-axis over time on the x-axis. Let's go back to the value graph. In order to adjust the graph, the first step is to select your keyframes and then apply Easy Ease. You can use this button to apply Easy Ease. Now the graph has a curve to it and there are handles, which are called Bezier handles or influence handles, that you can use to adjust the curve of the graph to change the spacing of an animation. Remember, this is the value graph. It's telling us that the rotation starts out at this angle and later in time it ends at this angle. The slope or steepness of the graph tells us about the speed. The flatter the line, the slower, and the steeper the line, the faster the motion. This graph starts out not very steep, so our shape is starting off slow. Then the slope increases in the middle here, so the shape is moving quickly. Then the slope starts to level off towards the end, which means that the shape is slowing down. Now let's look at the same thing, but in the speed graph. So here you get the same info about the spacing of your animation, but it's just presented in a different way. Remember, the y-axis is speed, so when the speed is slow, the speed graph is going to be closer to 0 on the y-axis. Then in the middle of these keyframes, the speed is fastest, so the speed is furthest from 0 on the y-axis. Then the shape slows down before coming to a stop, so the speed graph dips back down, eventually reaching 0. Sometimes the speed graph can be negative, which can trip people up. A few examples of when this happens is when a layer is scaling down, rotating to the left, or the opacity is animated towards 0. Whether the line is above or below 0, the closer the line is to 0, the slower the speed, and the further from 0, the faster. What makes an animation that has some kind of easing applied to it look better than linear keyframes is the fact that there's acceleration and deceleration, which is common in real life. If you want to know how fast a layer is accelerating or decelerating, look at the slope of the speed graph. I can increase the acceleration by adjusting the handles to make the slope of the speed graph really steep here. Now you can see that the shape really accelerates from its starting point. The same thing applies to deceleration, but the slope will be downward. So if I pull this handle, there's a faster deceleration here. One graph might seem easier to you than the other, but it's important to understand both the value and the speed graph because there are times when one graph is better than the other to adjust the spacing of a certain property. This shape is moving linearly from left to right, as we can see in this value graph, and this is the line for the x position. The y position isn't changing, so the graph is flat. Now let's look at the speed graph. This just shows the overall speed. It doesn't separate out x and y. Since these are linear keyframes, the graph is flat at this constant speed. Let's go back to the value graph and adjust the spacing of this animation. The first step is always to add easy ease to get Bezier handles. But when you apply easy ease to the position property, the value graph still doesn't have handles. In order to get handles to adjust the spacing of the position property, you have to separate the x and y values. To do that, right-click on Position and choose Separate Dimensions, or click this button. Then apply easy ease again because separating dimensions set the keyframes back to linear. Now there are handles. I'm going to delete the Y position keyframes because I don't want the shape to move up and down. Let's adjust the easing on the X position so it shoots out, then really eases into its final position. The speed graph looks like this. The shape accelerates quickly here, reaches peak speed, then decelerates before coming to a stop. For a simple animation like this, both the value and speed graph are easy to use. Let's look at an example where I want this circle to follow this specific motion path. If I tried to adjust the easing in the value graph, it would be a lot more difficult. First, I'd have to separate the dimensions to get handles and reapply easy ease. That messes up the motion path and it makes it so that there are no Bezier handles to adjust the motion path here. So I'd have to try to figure out how to adjust the x and y value graphs to get the motion path back to the way I wanted it, and that's going to be really difficult, let alone to adjust the easing on this animation. So this is the case when it's going to be a lot easier to adjust the speed graph. Here's the finished version of my animation. I adjusted the speed graph so that the circle looks like it's sliding over hills. It goes faster when it's moving down and slower when it's going up. I pulled this keyframe up so it reaches peak speed at the bottom of the hill. At the top of the hill, the speed doesn't reach 0. It slows down, but it doesn't stop. When you're animating something falling or bouncing, it's usually easier to use the value graph. So here I separated the dimensions, and the x position is linear until the end when the ball rolls to a gradual stop. For the y position, I set a keyframe on the ground for each bounce, and then I adjusted the value graph to create an arc-shaped bounce. If I switch over to the speed graph, you can see how complicated this graph looks, so this is a case when you'll have a much easier time in the value graph. If you only remember one thing from this video, make it this. Keyframes should rarely stay linear. Easy ease is helpful, but it's just a starting point. The graph editor is where polished animations are made. And once you understand how spacing works and when to use the value graph versus the speed graph, the graph editor stops being this scary thing that you avoid and starts becoming a really powerful tool that you actually use. If this video helped things click even a little, my beginner After Effects course is built just for you. I walk through these concepts step by step with practical projects and guided exercises, so you're not just copying curves, you're actually learning how motion is supposed to feel. The free download link below has some of the same exercises as in the course, so start there. And if you want to go deeper and build confidence with animation fundamentals, join the course or the waitlist depending on when you're watching this. The link is below.